Welcome back, guys. In this video, we're going to be talking a little bit about Xcode. This is the program that you're going to be writing almost all of your code in and spending most of your time in as an iOS developer. When we first open the project, as you can see here, we can kind of see where our recent projects would be, or you can open an existing project that you have. And in addition to that, you can also start new projects. So right here, we've got a playground, for example, which will be getting into a little bit more in the beginning of this course, and then later in the course we'll be focusing on creating new Xcode projects. But I kind of just want to start by opening up a new Xcode project so we can kind of get a feel for what it is that we'll be working with inside the program. So when you first start up a new project, you're hit with this pane asking you what kind of app you want to create. I'm sure some of these will look a little bit familiar to you guys. A single view application is just a standard application. This is going to be what you're building most of the time. There's games, which uses Apple's Sprite Kit framework, which we'll be possibly getting into a little bit later in the course. There's tabbed applications, sticker pack app. I'm sure you've seen those before, as well as iMessage apps. But again, for the majority of this course, we're going to be focusing on single view applications. So let's start there. Let's click next. This is where we configure a couple of the settings surrounding the project, what the name of the project is. For the name of this project, we'll just put Learn Xcode. The team that you're on, the organization name, the organization identifier, these are things that we'll worry about a little bit later. These are not so important right now. Just leaving them as the default is fine, or filling them in if they're blank. The language that we're going to be in is Swift for this course. Objective-C is the language that iOS used to be programmed in, but we have since migrated to Swift, which is a much better and more elegant language. Trust me, if you've seen Objective-C before, you'll know what I'm talking about. Let's focus on Swift, though, for now. And the user interface options, we have Storyboard and Swift UI. At the time of recording this video, Swift UI is Apple's new layout framework, and we will be learning a little bit more about that later in the course, but right now it is still pretty standard to use storyboards. Any job that you would be getting right now would be primarily using storyboards, but again, if they are using Swift UI, if that's something you want to use, we'll be definitely covering that later in the course. The last three options down here is to use core data, which is just a way of storing things locally to the device. So if you close the app and come back, things will still remain. We will definitely be covering that later in the course. And unit tests and UI tests, these are things that we would write as programmers to make sure that our code is working properly after we push out updates. Again, more that we'll be talking about later in the course. For now, let's not worry too much about that. It's not so important right now. I certainly don't want to confuse you with any of this. So for now, let's just go ahead and click the next button, and let's drop it right here in whatever folder you want. I'm going to put it here in this Kojo folder. And that should bring us into the actual project. So here, there's a lot going on. It might even be a little bit overwhelming, but don't let it scare you. It's definitely something that with time will make a little bit more sense, and we're going to break it down into chunks where I'm going to make absolutely sure that by the time you're done with this course, all of this makes sense and it doesn't feel overwhelming. So to kind of start out, we're here looking at just the general properties of the application, such as the display name, the bundle identifier. This is just a unique identifier that's associated with your application. The version and build numbers, you've probably seen these on the App Store before if you ever updated an app and it went from maybe 1.0.1 to 1.0.2 or something like that. The build number is just an incrementing number that we will bump up each time we release a new version of the application as well. Don't need to worry about this too much right now. Here's where we'll set the target or the lowest iOS version that we want to support. There's many reasons why you might support one versus another. You might think, well, why not just go ahead and support all of them? Well, the problem is that Apple makes newer code and newer features available to you by using newer versions. And if you use older versions, you might have to use legacy code, or you might have to have a bunch of conditions in your code to do certain things if it's older or newer. So anyways, we'll cover this a little bit more, but for now, we'll probably mostly just be covering iOS, probably 12. iOS 12 and up has a lot of the features that we're going to be wanting to use. Here's where we would pick whether or not we want to support iPhone, iPad, or Mac. For the majority of this course, we're just going to be talking about iPhone and iPad. Device orientation. This is just how you want the device to sit. Do you want to support only vertical, or would you want to support landscape as well, left and right, so on and so forth. The status bar style. This is where you can set whether or not you want a dark or black status bar at the top of the application. This would be like where your Wi-Fi indicator's at and your time and so on and so forth. So if you'd want a dark one, you could pick that. If you want a light one, you could pick the other option. And then we've got a couple other options down below that we're not going to worry too much about right now. These are a little bit more uncommon. So we'll kind of cover those a little bit later. And obviously there's a lot more options up here. These are going to be a little bit more advanced. Also things that are just not so common. So we'll cover those maybe a little bit later. So then let's kind of mosey on to the left side of the application here. And this is our navigator window. So we can see the structure of the project. We can see here that we've got a few files and they've got a couple little icons next to them. The little orange bird indicates that this is a Swift file. It's just a little icon for Swift. And then this is the storyboard icon. The yellow folder is just a group or folder icon, and this would be like an assets or resources. And then this would be like a plist. So anyways, the icons just represent what type of file it is. We'll be going into what all these different file types mean a little bit later. And then if we jump over here to the right, this is where we have a property inspector, and we can kind of look a little bit more into the things that we are currently accessing. So maybe a better example of this is, let's go ahead and open up the storyboard file. This is where we will actually be creating the layouts for our application. So for example, we might want to bring a label onto the screen, and this would just be a piece of text that we want to display in the application. And you could see as soon as I drag that onto the screen that we got a whole bunch of properties that are associated with this label over here. So again, this is the inspector. This is where we would be changing these things. So if, for example, I wanted to change what the label said, I could come in here and I could type col, and you could see that it changes in the storyboard. So there's all sorts of other stuff here, most of which is a little bit self-explanatory, such as like the color of the font style, the text, so on and so forth. A couple of these are a little bit more advanced, and we will definitely be covering these throughout the course. But again, the purpose of this video is just to give you an idea of what the Xcode environment looks like. So we have a couple more options over here. We've got like a little ruler icon, and this just represents the size inspector and frame inspector for this element. So we can move it around on the screen if we want to a little bit, or you can type in these options if you want to. So you've got a lot of options as far as like moving this thing around. A couple of these other things we'll cover a little bit later. Again, I know this might seem a little bit overwhelming right now, but it'll make a whole lot more sense as we go through the course. So don't worry about that right now. We will definitely be covering all of this. Over here on the left, we've got the ability to look at the contents of the view controller scene and the storyboard as a whole. If you've ever worked with design software, you may have seen something similar to this. This would be kind of similar to like looking at layers in a design application or something like that. So if we just have a lot of elements on screen, for example, you can see them all over here, and instead of maybe clicking on them in the actual storyboard, you could select them over here and essentially do the same thing. This might become really useful if we have a lot of elements on top of each other. We can't, for example, maybe click the one in the back, so we might need to come over here and click it in the inspector. We can also delete elements from over here. We could do all sorts of stuff. We've got a lot of options over here. So that covers that. Now, as a whole, the Xcode environment can kind of stretch or move to your liking. And what I mean by that is we've got a lot of options to hide and show panels that we want to take a look at, or maybe we're not using at the moment, so we can hide them. The same thing goes for this little panel right here. We can actually click this little button, and that's going to expand and collapse this little section right here. The last little section that we haven't really covered is the debug area, which appears down below. This is really for the developer to look at messages that might appear throughout the application that can indicate certain things. For example, we might want to see some data related to some element that we're working with in the application, and we might be able to log that information here. So this information, or this section, is really for the developer mostly. Also, if the application were to crash, this is where we would get a log of maybe what caused the crash or what initiated the crash or something like that. So that kind of covers the 3 or 4 panels that we'll mainly be working with. Obviously, you saw me working with the little toolbar up here. This is where we can just modify the look of the environment. We can add labels to the screen. And then lastly, maybe over here, we can select what device we want to be testing on. You can see there's a lot here. We can add additional simulators or build to a device that we have connected. That's where we would select that. And then this would just be the run button to actually run it on the device. So that kind of covers the upper toolbar. That's kind of just a good overview of Xcode. I just wanted to get you a little bit familiar with where we're going to be working. This will be your workspace forever as an iOS developer. Again, I can't say it enough. Don't be worried if it's a little overwhelming right now. It's a lot to take in, but I can guarantee you, as somebody that went through the same thing that you're going through now, eventually this is going to start to make a lot more sense. As we build more applications, you're going to start to find things and piece things together, and it'll become a whole lot more or less confusing, I should say. So that kind of wraps up this video. In the next video, we'll actually start writing a little bit of code.